Have you ever stopped to consider how much more an inheritance can be than just money or material possessions? Most people believe that family disputes over inheritance are just ordinary quarrels, but what lies behind every altered will, every fight over what is owed, is something much deeper, something that can destroy entire families. Imagine that behind the death of a wealthy and influential man, there's more than simple greed, a psychological and strategic game involving manipulation, desperation, and ultimately a mystery that could change the lives of everyone involved. Before we continue with this story full of twists and turns and suspense, let me ask you, are you subscribed to the channel? If not, please hit the subscribe button, give it a thumbs up, and leave a comment below because it helps us deliver more content like this directly to you. Let's continue. Now, what happens when the fight for inheritance turns into a true battle for survival? When do you begin to understand that money and power are just the tip of the iceberg, and what's at stake is control over each person's life? Believe me, this goes far beyond a simple will. We're talking about a game where every move is crucial, and in the end, the winner isn't always who you expected. Stay with me, because you won't want to miss what comes next. The revelation of who's really behind all this will surprise you. I'll never forget the case of the poisoned inheritance. It was one of those investigations where you feel the truth is at your fingertips, but it always seems to elude you. The story began with the death of Harold Williams, a small-town business magnate. He was a man of great wealth and no obvious heirs. His will was elaborately drafted, leaving his fortune to distant family members, something that initially seemed strange. However, what really captured my attention was the fact that he mysteriously disappeared before his death, and his death was shrouded in profound mystery. Upon learning this, the idea of a legacy of blood and poison quickly gripped me, and the heirs, they were all on the front lines, with their own agendas, waiting to get their share of the pie. What seemed like a simple dispute over fortune soon turned into a minefield. Relations between the family members were anything but friendly. Old rivalries, power struggles, and unresolved feelings created fertile ground for something more sinister to unfold. I began to overhear conversations about who might be involved and what each had to lose. The whole drama seemed like something out of a thriller, but it was real, and I was in the middle of it. What intrigued me most was the fact that everyone involved seemed to have something to hide. I sensed that the inheritance dispute was just the tip of the iceberg, and beneath the surface, something much darker was taking shape. As the investigation progressed, I realized this wasn't just a financial crime. It was a psychological war between people willing to do anything, including lying, manipulating, and even killing. The deeper I dug, the deeper I peeled back the layers of the Williams family history. It was like a game of chess, where every move seemed perfectly calculated. And just when it seemed I was beginning to understand each person's motivations, more secrets emerged. What seemed like a simple case of disputed inheritance was leading me down a much darker path. As the tension mounted, I realized someone was playing a game far dirtier than any of us could have imagined. And then something happened. The key to solving the entire enigma was about to reveal itself. I knew I was close, but there was still a crucial piece missing. But what would happen next? Who was responsible for all this? The investigation was far from over, and with each new step I got closer to a truth that would leave me breathless. The Williams family wasn't a picture of harmony. On the contrary, there was more rivalry than anything else. Harold, patriarch, had children, but they hadn't spoken to each other for years. Harold was a demanding man with a difficult temperament, who always had his preferences when it came to whom he trusted most. One of his sons, Robert, was always the most diligent, but never received the recognition he felt he deserved. On the other hand, Sarah, his daughter, was seen as the family rebel, whom no one took seriously. And of course, there was Emily, the wife who stood by Harold's side but seemed more focused on securing her daughter's future than on her own husband. What intrigued me most was the fact that, although everyone hated each other, they were all willing to work together for the inheritance. This forced union, fueled by ambition, was far from genuine. According to some former family employees, the atmosphere inside the mansion was icy, with arguments and distrust hanging in the air. To me, this wasn't just a dispute over inheritance. It was a psychological game. Each tried to manipulate the other, currying favor, trying to be the most trustworthy in order to secure a larger share. It wasn't hard to see how these relationships walked the fine line between friendship and betrayal. What no one knew was that behind every forced smile and polite gesture, there were long-held secrets, things Harold's children preferred to keep buried. And soon, these hurts began to surface. My job then was to try to understand what motivated each of them, while also paying attention to the small details that could be revealing. No one thought the other had so much to hide, but as the investigation progressed, I began to realize that each of their motivations went far beyond money. They were involved in something far more complex than they imagined. No matter how hard I tried to advance their story, something always seemed to pull me back to their deeper motivations. What appeared to be a fight for money was in fact intrinsically linked to long-held traumas and resentments. Each heir was playing a psychological game where the greatest prize was not only the inheritance but also the recognition they had never received. And as this became clear to me, something else emerged. Perhaps the key to the case lay precisely at the heart of these resentments. But of course, the real mystery was yet to come. I knew that to fully understand this family's dynamics, something more needed to be uncovered, and I was about to find out what had really happened to Harold. Harold Williams's death was initially treated as a natural occurrence, but something inside me told me there was more to it. A man of his standing, with so many enemies surrounding him, couldn't have died by mere chance. He was in good health, or at least appeared to be. The police were initially quick to conclude that he had simply died of natural causes, possibly a heart attack, but the details of the crime scene didn't make sense. Harold was in his library alone, with a half-finished glass of wine. The staff hadn't heard any suspicious sounds, no one had seen anything unusual, and most intriguingly, there was no sign of a struggle. It was as if he had fallen suddenly without warning, which seemed very convenient for someone with something to hide. The first thing I did was look around, trying to understand what was happening there. A mansion with so many rooms and narrow corridors seemed to hide more secrets than the family cared to admit. The fact that Harold had been found alone in one of the most secluded rooms gave me the feeling that it was, at the very least, orchestrated. Out of nowhere, something in that setting was trying to tell me that he was about to be silenced. Silenced, but by whom? And why? It wasn't just inheritance issues that were at stake, but something larger, something I couldn't yet grasp. As the autopsy progressed, clues began to pile up. The coroner found evidence of poisoning, further ruling out the possibility of a natural death. Therein lay the key to what had truly happened. Harold's death was no accident. It had been meticulously planned, and the strangest thing was that everyone around him seemed to have a motive. As suspicions began to form, the family fell into denial. Each tried to deflect blame from the other, but they were all being drawn into the web of intrigue that was forming around them. Now, what really intrigued me was how someone managed to manipulate Harold so carefully. He was an intelligent man with a vast network of contacts, and he knew what was at stake. Something told me Harold didn't die by accident. His death was the result of a plan hatched by someone within his own household. I just needed to find out who had the skill and courage to carry out such an act. And soon I would understand that it wasn't just a matter of greed or revenge, but something even darker at play. I was getting closer to figuring out what had really happened in that house, but how would such a crucial piece fit into the larger puzzle? The answer was getting closer, but many questions still remained to be resolved. When I began investigating the circumstances of Harold's death, the poisoning didn't seem to be the only mystery to be solved. What troubled me most were the accounts of those closest to him in the days leading up to his death. Harold wasn't well, and I learned this from witnesses. At first, everyone said he seemed a little more tired, as if suffering from unusual fatigue. But no one was too concerned. After all, he was an elderly man with a demanding routine. and a simple cold could be the explanation. However, as I pieced together his schedule over the last few days, something caught my attention. His symptoms were unusual, and they definitely weren't simple explanation. Reports began to emerge that Harold was complaining of generalized weakness, as if he had a feeling something was wrong with his body but couldn't pinpoint what. And on one of the last days before his death, he was seen in his office trying to write something on paper but shaking in a visibly uncomfortable manner. As an investigator, I knew these often overlooked details were crucial. The sudden weakness, the unexplained pains, and the growing sense of malaise are beginning to draw a fine line between what could be a natural illness and what appeared to be being manipulated. In speaking with the doctors who had treated him, I discovered that Harold had in fact seen a specialist because of these symptoms. The initial diagnosis was vague, something like a viral illness or a temporary condition, but there was something more, something hidden beneath the layers of his behavior. The sudden change in his health seemed to indicate that the poison was being administered gradually, in a controlled dose, making the symptoms progressively stronger and harder to identify as poisoning. If someone was truly poisoning Harold, how were they doing it in such a calculated way? The answer to this question was approaching, but it wasn't simple. The disease wasn't being treated as something common, but rather as something more cunning, something being introduced gradually so as not to arouse suspicion. And that's when I realized how insidious low-dose poisoning can be. The killer didn't want to kill Harold immediately. He wanted him to die slowly, making any investigation more difficult and the clues more nebulous. The poison wasn't the only factor, but pacing and manipulation were key. Now, with this new information, I knew the investigation was about to take an even darker turn. Everything indicated that whoever committed the crime had impressive control over every step of Harold's death. And as I further researched the poisons, I began to wonder, was whoever committed this crime simply waiting for the right moment to reveal their true intentions? When the police finally handed over Harold's will, it was anything but what anyone expected. Here was a document that made absolutely no sense in the context of everything I had already learned about the family. The will surprisingly excluded almost all of the immediate family, leaving his fortune to charities and a few close friends. But most curious was the name of an unexpected heir, a distant niece, whom no one had mentioned in years. She had apparently had no contact with Harold since childhood, which made her inclusion in the will all the more strange. To me, this was a clear indication that Harold was somehow trying to pull a scam, or perhaps he had regrets about something in the past. The will itself appeared to have been hastily written, and the signatures raised many suspicions. Not only was it dated, but some of the words were scribbled out as if edited at the last minute. As an investigator, I immediately suspected fraud and began to delve into the details of the document. I wondered if someone could have manipulated the will while Harold was still alive, perhaps taking advantage of his physical and mental frailty to force him to change his decisions. What intrigued me most was the presence of his niece, who seemed to be the last person to have anything to gain. Or perhaps she was a key player in a much larger game. In a conversation with Harold's wife, Emily, she seemed disconcerted by the will. She couldn't believe that Harold would make such a decision of his own free will. Emily stated that she had always had a close relationship with her husband, but when she learned of the inheritance, her expression changed, and the tension in the room was palpable. However, her wife wasn't just upset by the lack of inheritance, but by the way everything was being handled. Something about her seemed to know more than she was willing to say, but at that moment, the pressure was greater than her desire to hide the truth. I could tell she was too nervous to be completely honest with me. The feeling I had was that this will not only strained family relations, but also fueled suspicion. It was being used as a tool, an excuse to create even more chaos and suspicion among the heirs. I began to question who really had control over Harold's finances, who in fact had access to his will, and more importantly, who would benefit most from the changes he made. Like in a game of chess, the pieces began to move and the trustworthy pieces crumbled, leaving everyone suspicious and anxious. As the investigation continued, I began to realize that the will, rather than providing a solution, only raised more questions. Who was behind this? Who had the ability and opportunity to manipulate Harold in such a way? Something told me the next step was about to lead me even deeper into this tangle of lies and manipulation. When I began working on Harold's case, the situation seemed like a complicated puzzle, and I was the missing piece. The initial investigation followed a traditional path, with police trying to solve the case as just another elderly death due to natural complications. But something told me there was much more to the case than met the eye. The first steps were simple: interviews with the family, analysis of the initial evidence, and a review of the environment where Harold was found. But the deeper I dug, the more I realized the case was far from simple. The Williams family had many layers, and the lies were interwoven like a well-woven web. The police, naturally, wanted to follow protocol. They combed through Harold's medical records and questioned family members. However, what I noticed was that many details were being overlooked. The tension in the house was palpable, and no one seemed willing to fully cooperate. It wasn't long before I began to sense that the real crime lay in the relationships between the family members, far more than in Harold's death itself. There was something in their behavior, something in the way they carried themselves, that told me they were trying to hide more than simply an inheritance dispute. That's when I made a decision. My investigation couldn't rely solely on physical evidence. I needed to understand the emotions and family dynamics. Harold's death wasn't just a tragedy, it was the catalyst for an explosive conflict of interests and secrets. Each family member had something to lose and much to hide. It wasn't clear whether ambition, resentment, or revenge motivated them, but one thing was certain: they were all lying to me in some way. Every word, every gesture was a clue, and I was beginning to piece together this complex story. But at the same time, I realized the police had their own limitations. They were stuck on a line of inquiry that wasn't getting me anywhere. Something more was needed, something only an experienced investigator could spot. I decided I needed to delve deeper, breaking the mold of conventional investigation. It wasn't the obvious facts that interested me, but the subtler details. How Harold had died and the family's behavior after the event indicated something much bigger than a simple dispute over property. As the days passed, I knew something was about to break. Traditional investigation had proven fruitless. But one thing was clear: the Williams family members were playing a game of manipulation, and I needed to understand the rules of this game before it was too late. But the real revelation was still ahead of me, waiting to be uncovered, and I just needed to take the next step. The investigation took a decisive turn when the autopsy revealed that Harold's cause of death was poisoning. This wasn't something the police initially considered, but for me, the evidence was clear from the start. The death wasn't just an accident, it was a deliberate, carefully planned act. The poison used was a rare and highly toxic one that can be administered almost imperceptibly, in doses so small they're not easily detectable in routine tests. Strychnine, arsenic, or even more modern poisons, each has its own peculiarities but all require careful handling. Soon, I faced the challenge of finding the exact poison that killed Harold. But I knew that somewhere in the shadows of William's house I would find the clue. As I investigated the poison's origin, I quickly realized it wasn't easily accessible. The type of substance used was out of reach for most people. My first hypothesis was that a family member had direct access to something so dangerous, like a pharmacist or even a doctor. But after speaking with confidential sources, it became clear that the poison had been acquired clandestinely, likely through an intermediary. The mystery was deepening. I knew it couldn't be just a coincidence. There was someone more involved in this case, someone with connections and the necessary knowledge to handle poisons of such magnitude. The most perplexing part was how the poison had been administered. The victim showed no immediate symptoms, suggesting the poisoning had been administered over several days in small doses. I began retracing Harold's steps in the final days of his life, trying to trace any interactions he had had with anyone outside his immediate family circle. After all, a poison administered with such caution and precision required careful planning. The solution, as I would soon realize, lay in the things Harold touched, the people he encountered, and most importantly, the secrets hidden in the darkest corners of his home. The poison investigation brought a new perspective to the case. It wasn't just a question of who would inherit the inheritance, but who was actually willing to go to such lengths to obtain something that, until then, seemed unattainable. Each clue showed me that the line between suspects was becoming more blurred, but the poison was only the beginning, and what lay behind it still intrigued me. The next step would be to discover who was truly behind all this intrigue, and how the poisoning fit into the even larger puzzle. After the poisoning was revealed, dynamics within the Williams family became even more turbulent. The inheritance, already fiercely contested, was now suspended indefinitely while the investigation continued. The news came as a bombshell. The heirs, who had previously seen themselves as the rightful owners of Harold's fortune, now faced the uncertainty of an imminent trial. The dispute was no longer just about money, but also about control of the narrative and the ability to protect their own image. Every move theirs made seemed calculated to gain an advantage in the upcoming court case. When the inheritance was frozen, the pressure on family members increased exponentially. Robert, the eldest son, who had always believed he would be his father's natural successor, could not hide his resentment. He felt the will, which disinherited him, was an insult to everything he had done for the family. Sarah, on the other hand, saw the suspension of the inheritance as an opportunity to regain control of the situation and attempt to manipulate the other heirs. Emily, his wife, became increasingly reserved, but her treacherous behavior was already clear. Everyone's eyes were on her, as Harold's wife could have been the key to the truth, or at least the person with the most power within the household. It was at this point that I realized that the suspension of the inheritance was not only affecting the family dynamic, but also fueling a cycle of distrust and manipulation. It was as if everyone was trying to make the others look guilty while hiding their own secrets. Some family members began aggressively trying to reverse the situation, as if seeking to push the investigation in a specific direction. Others were more interested in creating alliances within the family, aiming to secure as much of the estate as possible. I knew these disputes were not just about material possessions, but about something much deeper: control over Harold's memory and what he would leave behind. As I watched all this closely, I knew that the key to solving the case lay directly in this struggle over the inheritance. What intrigued me even more was the fact that, as the family turned against itself, the true motivation behind the crime seemed to have been forgotten. The feud was overshadowing the darker elements of the story. Someone was manipulating them all, and it seemed that the longer the inheritance was held in suspense, the darker the secrets became. What was really behind all these maneuvers? Who was behind the smokescreen? I knew I could only discover this by delving deeper, challenging the complex alliances and distrust that were gripping the family. As the investigation progressed, what had previously seemed like a mere family dispute over material possessions began to take a more sinister turn. When you're investigating cases like this, it's not enough to simply look at the obvious evidence. You need to understand the motives and, more importantly, the opportunities. And each member of the Williams family had a motive. But the question was, who had the perfect opportunity to act? Who had enough to lose or gain from Harold's death? Robert, the eldest son, seemed on the verge of an explosion at any moment. He always felt undervalued, as if his father never recognized his efforts. The inheritance Harold had left him was too small for Robert's ambition. He had more to lose than anyone else. In speaking with those close to him, I discovered that he had discussed on several occasions the fact that he didn't trust his father to leave him the entire fortune. These conversations weren't simple venting. They carried a weight, a desire for revenge that could have become the driving force behind such a meticulously planned crime. Sarah, on the other hand, seemed more calculating. She didn't display the same emotions as Robert, but her actions showed she wasn't going to give up without a fight. She had personal and financial reasons for wanting Harold out of the way. And most intriguing of all was her ability to manipulate situations and people to her advantage. Even with all eyes on her, Sarah seemed to be taking strategic steps within the investigation, as if she already knew something the others hadn't yet discovered. For her, the poisoning might have been just the means, not the end. The real victory lay in manipulating the family and the situation to secure what was owed to her. Emily, Harold's wife, also had her own reasons for acting. She didn't want to lose control, but she also couldn't lose the inheritance. However, she seemed unwilling to get directly involved in the discussions. She seemed more focused on maintaining her appearance as a traumatized widow than on truly dealing with the consequences of her husband's death. But her interactions with other family members began to reveal clues that perhaps she had much more in mind than simply mourning Harold's loss. What did she want, after all? And what was her true relationship with her niece, the unknown heir? These motives and opportunities were beginning to intertwine. It was no longer a question of who had the greatest desire to kill Harold, but of who had the perfect opportunity to act when the moment arrived. Knowing that everyone was playing their cards to secure the inheritance, I realized the case was further from being solved. Now I needed to understand what each of them was willing to sacrifice to achieve their goal, and what was behind this uncontrollable desire for power. Over time, the investigation began to point to a prime suspect, Robert, the eldest son. He not only had the strongest motive, but also the ideal opportunity. Robert's behavior in the days following his father's death was already suspicious enough that I put him in the spotlight. He was nervous, acting strangely, and most importantly, his desire to control the inheritance was evident in his every action. He seemed to want to shed any responsibility that linked him to Harold's death, but somehow, this only made his actions more obvious. As I delved deeper into his life, I began to realize that Robert wasn't the simple betrayed son he wanted others to believe. There was something in his personality that revealed a darker, more calculating side. He had easy access to every part of the house and had always spent the most time with Harold in his later years, which provided him with the perfect opportunity to commit the crime. Furthermore, throughout our investigation, several accounts of heated arguments between them emerged, especially in the days leading up to Harold's death. Robert felt neglected and despised by his father, and that resentment, as I well knew, was the perfect fuel for a tragedy like this. However, what made me even more uncomfortable was the fact that Robert didn't seem as remorseful as I'd expected. On the contrary, he was increasingly aggressive and defensive. When confronted, his reaction wasn't surprise but hostility, as if he were trying to intimidate anyone who dared doubt his innocence. This told me he had something to hide, and the way he tried to maintain control of the situation only reinforced my suspicion that he was behind it all. But there was something else, something that didn't completely convince me he was solely responsible. What I saw in Robert wasn't a clear confession, but a series of clues that aligned perfectly to paint a picture of guilt. However, I still lacked solid proof, something that went beyond the assumptions and psychology unfolding before me. To achieve that, I knew I would have to dig even deeper, uncover the most hidden layers of the story. Perhaps Robert's mistake was allowing himself to be so exposed, but who was really pulling the strings behind him? I felt I was getting closer to uncovering the truth, but what would happen when I actually reached the answer? I was just beginning to discover that the guilty parties aren't always who they seem. The truth, as always, was far more complex. Just when everything seemed to be heading toward a logical conclusion, a new factor emerged that changed the course of the investigation. The revelation of Harold Williams's secret will shook the foundations of everything we thought we knew about the inheritance. In one of the old files I found, there was a document that no one, not even the family, knew existed. This will, although dated earlier, completely contradicted the official will found after his death. While the public will excluded almost all direct heirs, the secret one left virtually the entire fortune to Robert, the eldest son, including real estate, bank accounts, and most unexpected of all, a valuable art collection. This will made no sense to anyone in the family. Even the niece, the heir in the official will, did not appear in the secret will at all. I became obsessed with this new will. It seemed out of place, as if it had been written in a moment of complete lucidity, but the problem was that no one seemed to remember its existence. Even Robert, the prime suspect, seemed surprised when he found out about the secret will. His first reaction was to try to discredit it, claiming it was a forgery, but something didn't make me feel at ease. This will could have been the real reason for Harold's death. a final attempt to manipulate an already manipulative situation. Why would Harold leave a different version of his will, one that didn't even mention his niece? This was a question that needed to be answered, and soon. It was at this point that I began to question whether the secret will had been written by Harold or had been forged. As I investigated further, I realized there was ample evidence that the will had been altered by a third party, someone who had access to Harold during his final days. I searched for records of when this will was made, trying to understand the context in which it was written. What I found intrigued me even more. It had been made in a hospital. On one of the few occasions Harold was admitted, apparently without any family members around. What did this mean? Who was there with him at that moment? Could this will hold the key to revealing the true culprit? The big question that still lingered was, who would have the audacity to forge such a radically different will, and where did this intention come from? Was it someone within the family manipulating the details to secure the inheritance for themselves, or was it an external figure we hadn't yet considered? This will showed me that appearances were deceiving and that the line between truth and manipulation was blurrier than ever. Now the pieces were beginning to fit together very differently than I had imagined, and the search for the truth became even more intriguing. But what would come after this discovery? The truth was coming closer, and the next steps would be crucial to understanding how this forged will fit into the puzzle. It was no longer just about who had killed Harold, but who was really behind this whole mess. The investigation began to take a new turn when I began focusing on indirect evidence, the kind that isn't as obvious but over time begins to paint a clearer picture. In the Harold Williams case, physical evidence was limited, but circumstantial evidence began to accumulate. When it comes to crimes like this, the smallest pieces can be the most revealing. For example, I revisited Harold's finances and found mysterious bank transactions that occurred shortly before his death. In one of these transactions, a large sum of money was transferred to an account held by a shell company, the owners of which were unknown. The connection to family members was unclear, but I knew something there needed to be investigated more thoroughly. At the same time, the testimonies began to line up in strange ways. One of the mansion's servants, who had worked for the family for years, told me a story about seeing Sarah in one of the hallways near Harold's office shortly before her death. She was carrying something with her, a small box that, on the surface, seemed of no great value. However, the servant couldn't remember exactly what was inside. It was a small clue, but it began to give me an uneasy feeling that Sarah, or someone connected to her, might be involved in some deeper way. Perhaps that box was the missing key to connecting the dots. The indirect evidence, however, didn't stop there. During a conversation with one of the family lawyers, I discovered that one of the wills had been stored in a safe deposit box in Harold's name, but curiously, no one knew exactly where it was. Only a few people had access to the safe deposit box, and one of those people was his wife, Emily. When I asked more questions about this safe deposit box, Emily became evasive and even a bit defensive, which to me was a clear sign that she was trying to hide something. Her behavior became even more suspicious when, under pressure, she mentioned that the will could have been changed without her knowledge. Something didn't add up. If she was in control, why was she so nervous talking about it? And as if that weren't enough, Harold's phone records showed frequent calls to an unknown number in the days before his death. This number was traced to a financial advisory firm, and upon investigation I discovered that the firm was linked to an old childhood friend of Harold's, someone with whom he had had complicated relationships in the past. This friend apparently stood to benefit from a large sum if Harold died before making a new will. It was another piece that fell into place, but it still remained to understand how deeply this friend was involved in Harold's manipulation. The indirect evidence began to form a dense web of suspicion, and one thing became clear: the case was far from simple. With each step, with each piece of evidence, it became more evident that Harold had been manipulated by more than one person. We were dealing with a carefully orchestrated crime where everyone involved had something to lose and was willing to play dirty to get what they wanted. When investigating a case like this, never underestimate the power of a witness who comes forward at the right time. Most of the people I interviewed were secretive, trying to protect something or someone. However, a turning point occurred when, weeks into the investigation, a key witness finally came forward. It was a former family gardener, a man named Walter, who had worked for Harold many years before and had been dismissed without clear explanation. At first, no one paid much attention to Walter, until he revealed something no one else knew. He had seen Harold's wife, Emily, in a secret conversation with Harold's personal physician just days before his death. This conversation, according to Walter, seemed extremely tense. He mentioned that at one point he heard Emily say something like, "If he gets any weaker, we can't wait any longer." Emily's words, from the tone in which they were delivered, sounded like confirmation that she was involved in the plan to eliminate Harold, or at least hasten his death. The gardener, however, was so frightened by what he had heard that he decided to stay away from the house completely and never spoke about what happened again until that moment. He seemed hesitant to get more involved, fearing reprisals from powerful people, but he didn't hesitate to give me the crucial information that would change the direction of the investigation. I pondered Walter's fear for a moment. He knew something important, but had avoided getting involved before, perhaps because he didn't want to get mixed up with those in control. However, his account not only confirmed some of my suspicions about Emily, but also assured me that she was somehow deeply connected to Harold's death. Walter, by revealing himself as a witness, had opened a door to a new perspective, one in which his wife, initially considered a grieving widow, could be the central figure in the plot. The problem, however, was that Walter's words weren't enough to make any solid accusations. He couldn't prove what he'd heard, and without concrete evidence, his statement was just another clue in a sea of conjecture. But what he'd revealed made me think. The game was much dirtier than anyone imagined. The pressure to manipulate Harold's death came from within the house itself, and Emily seemed to be the mastermind behind the entire plan. Her behavior, with coldness and apparent control, was starting to make perfect sense, and now, with this new information, everything fell into place more clearly. What made me even more uneasy was the fact that after Walter's statement, other witnesses began to emerge, also willing to tell their stories, as if a network of people involved had finally begun to disintegrate, allowing the pieces that had been kept secret to come to light. Now, I knew the investigation was about to take a turn no one expected, and everything was about to be exposed. But who was really behind all this? I still had to discover more about the people operating in the shadows, manipulating and controlling the situation with cunning and ulterior motives. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, I began to realize that the true core of this mystery lay hidden in Harold and his family's past. Many of the secrets being revealed were not from yesterday, but from decades ago. Harold and his family's history was far from perfect. He had been married before, and Harold's first wife, Diana, had died under mysterious circumstances. For years, no one spoke of it, but I began to understand that this event had left deep scars on everyone involved. What initially seemed like just an untimely death may have been the first move in a larger family conspiracy. Harold's first wife had been a charming and intelligent woman, but also ambitious. According to some early accounts, she and Harold had been complicit in a series of shady dealings. When she died, everything seemed at peace, but the scars of that loss did not easily fade. The tragedy of her death remained unresolved, and Harold never fully remarried until he met Emily, his second wife. Looking back, I realized that Diana and Emily were more similar than anyone could have imagined. They both had ambitions of their own, and in some way shared a desire to control Harold's finances, perhaps even using questionable methods to achieve them. It was then that I began to delve deeper into Emily's past, and a series of surprises emerged. Emily wasn't just Harold's widow, she was deeply connected to a network of people who benefited from the tragedies that had occurred in Harold's life. And what shocked me most was discovering that Emily had been one of the last people to have contact with Diana shortly before her death. I began to trace Diana's path to Emily, and something began to form in my mind. Harold's death wasn't isolated, but part of a pattern of manipulation and death that had repeated itself over the years. I knew I needed to learn more about Diana to fully understand what was really going on. She seemed to hold the key to understanding Emily's behavior and what lay behind this entire web of deception that spanned generations. What I didn't yet realize was how much Harold's past, filled with betrayals and unsolved deaths, would directly impact the investigation into his death. But it was clear this wasn't just a dispute over inheritance, it was a game involving decades of manipulation and family secrets buried in time. What else would I learn about the Williams family's past? And how would it influence the motivations of Emily and the others involved? It was a line of investigation that could change everything, and I was ready to dig up more. As the mystery of Harold and his family's past began to unravel, a new layer was added to the investigation: connections to the outside world. As an investigator, I've always known that there's a point of intersection between a family's secrets and external interests. As I delved deeper into Harold's story, I discovered that he was connected to a number of people outside his immediate family circle, but who were closely tied to his business and personal interests. These people were somehow involved in the inheritance game, but not as visible participants. They were hidden players who over time began to reveal themselves as more influential than anyone could have imagined. The first to appear was a lawyer named Richard, who had handled many of Harold's financial transactions over the years. He wasn't just a legal advisor. Richard had a network of contacts that extended into the city's most obscure circles. During my conversations with him, I realized there was more to the relationship between him and Harold than simple financial advice. Richard seemed to know more about Harold's assets than anyone else in the family, and his answers, though cautious, were full of clues that he might be benefiting from something much larger than he was letting on. In addition to Richard, I discovered the existence of a secret lover of Harold's, someone outside the family circle who had also been overlooked in official accounts. Her name was Veronica, and she was one of the last people to see Harold alive before his death. Her relationship with him was complex, something that not even Harold's family knew about. Veronica didn't seem to have a strong interest in the inheritance itself, but she had something no one else did: a deep emotional connection to Harold, one that might have been enough to spur her to act. I interviewed her, and she very carefully revealed that Harold was deeply worried about being poisoned, something she believed to be unfounded paranoia, but she also made it clear that while she didn't know who was behind it, he had spoken about his distrust of family members. What made me most uncomfortable was realizing that both Richard and Veronica were connected to the network of external influences surrounding Harold. They weren't there just to take advantage of any material possessions he might leave behind, but to benefit from something much deeper: control over his actions, his legacy, and perhaps even his death. It was as if somehow Harold was being manipulated by forces outside his family, people who saw him as a key player in their own interests. This complicated the issue even further. Who was behind these external players? And how did these connections influence the inheritance dispute? The investigation was becoming a tangled web of manipulation, vested interests, and secrets involving far more people than anyone could have imagined. I was beginning to realize that this case wasn't just about the death of a wealthy and powerful man, but about how outside forces can unexpectedly interfere with family dynamics and the fates of everyone involved. And as always, I knew the truth was closer than ever. As Harold Williams's case progressed, something told me I wasn't seeing everything I needed to. It was as if the pieces that had been fitting together suddenly began to unravel, revealing a picture more complex than I could have imagined. Evidence that had seemed clear began to show signs of manipulation. This happened when I found a series of forged documents directly linked to the inheritance dispute, starting with the will, which appeared to have been altered subtly but with a care that could only have been done by someone with a deep understanding of the legal intricacies. Signatures, which previously appeared legitimate, began to show signs of wear, as if they had been made at different times under pressure or even with the use of forged ink and pen. When reviewing Harold's bank records, I found transfers that didn't match the family's explanations. Money was transferred to unregistered bank accounts, and some of these transactions were linked to shell companies, the same ones Emily had begun exploiting shortly after her husband's death. Looking deeper, I realized that the signatures and bank orders were also tainted with irregularities. As an investigator, I knew this couldn't be a simple coincidence. Someone within the family, or more likely, someone connected to it on the outside, was manipulating the evidence to construct a convenient narrative. What initially appeared to be a simple crime, a dispute over inheritance, now had a web of forgeries and manipulations behind it. The false evidence didn't stop there. At a crucial point in the investigation, I found email and text message records that had been deleted or altered to hide Harold's conversations and appointments with certain individuals involved in the case. What worried me most was that this evidence had been manipulated so carefully, almost professionally, that it was as if the manipulator himself were trying to construct a clean, flawless narrative. That's when I decided to enlist the help of a digital forensics expert to search Harold's devices, hoping to find traces that others hadn't seen. And as I expected, he found more than I imagined. The feeling of being in a chess game where the pieces were being moved strategically intensified. Now the investigation was being conducted almost clandestinely, with someone within the family using their knowledge and resources to twist the narrative in their favor. It was no longer just a question of who was guilty, but who was behind this web of falsifications. And with each new piece of evidence uncovered, my confidence that someone within Harold's household was manipulating the case solidified. The question that wouldn't leave me alone was, how far would the manipulations go? And more importantly, who was orchestrating all this dirty play? This manipulation of evidence was a masterstroke, but now I was determined to track down the source of these forgeries and uncover the truth. I knew the real culprit was much closer than I'd imagined, and these forgeries were merely a distraction. But what else had been hidden? That was the question beginning to consume me, and I knew that finding the answer would turn the entire Harold Williams case irreversibly. In investigations like Harold Williams's, there's always a point where human reason intertwines with desperation, and this can be the fuel that ignites a tragedy. As I began to examine the family members more deeply, I realized it wasn't just about ambition, but a deep, visceral desperation. They were fighting for more than money. They were fighting for survival, power, and control over Harold's legacy that defined the course of their lives. When things get tight and you feel like you're about to lose everything, people tend to make drastic decisions, especially when what's at stake is the immediate future of a life filled with debt and personal failure. Robert, for example, wasn't just the neglected son. He was in desperate financial straits. His professional life was in ruins, and he knew that without the inheritance, he would lose his only chance to change his destiny. When he learned that Harold had made changes to the will, leaving him out of it, his anger wasn't just an emotional reaction. It was the reaction of a man who felt his last chance to redeem himself had been taken from him. Robert's desperation drove him to the point of obsession. He wasn't just fighting for an inheritance. He was fighting for his own identity and for a future that without Harold's fortune seemed bleak and hopeless. Emily, meanwhile, was trapped in an equally desperate situation, but for more subtle reasons. She had married Harold knowing he possessed great wealth, but she didn't realize that her control over everything she wanted and felt she deserved was now at risk. She no longer had the patience to wait for a peaceful end. Emily, with her own financial problems and a need to keep up appearances, had become entangled in a web of manipulation. The pressure to maintain her status and material comforts drove her to make decisions that deep down she knew were wrong, but which seemed like the only solution. The desire to secure her daughter's future, and perhaps her own survival, led her to become more deeply involved in actions she initially believed she wouldn't have the courage to take. And then there was Sarah, Harold's rebellious daughter, who always felt like she didn't belong in that world of wealth and ostentation. She looked to Harold's inheritance as a way to finally find her place in society and leave behind a life of frustration and disillusionment. But Sarah's desperation wasn't just about money. She wanted more than money, she wanted recognition. Always in the shadow of her brothers, she knew that to finally be seen, she needed to get what she believed was her right. When news of the will began to circulate, Sarah saw a golden opportunity. Her relationship with Harold was never perfect, but the feeling of being unappreciated by him led her to take drastic measures. Desperation underlay every action of the Williams family members. What once seemed like a simple fight for an inheritance now revealed itself as a war where everyone was willing to sacrifice anything, even Harold's life, to ensure their own interests were served. As the pressure mounts and options begin to disappear, the line between right and wrong becomes increasingly blurred. What would happen when everyone's desperation collides? What would be the breaking point, and who would ultimately lose everything? Desperation was shaping every move, every decision. and soon it would give me the answer I so desperately sought. The Harold Williams investigation seemed to be heading toward an inevitable conclusion, with every clue pointing to the family as the culprit. But then, in a moment I'll never forget, the investigation took a turn that would change everything. I was reviewing call logs and documents, trying to link Harold's last transactions and encounters, when something caught my eye. An email, seemingly irrelevant at first, led to an unbelievable discovery. The sender wasn't a family member, but rather an outside figure no one would ever suspect. The key to the mystery lay in a little-known lawyer who had worked with Harold years before, but who, strangely, appeared to be the person responsible for several documents signed at the time of Harold's death. The lawyer, who had remained in the shadows throughout the entire process, was actually a central figure in the plot. He had been responsible for many of the modifications to the will and, most importantly, for ensuring that the bank transactions were protected. But most striking of all, he was directly connected to one of Harold's major business competitors. Throughout, he was the missing link, manipulating not only Harold's family but also taking advantage of the situation to significantly benefit himself. Instead of being merely a witness or a legal advisor, he had become a silent manipulator, orchestrating every move discreetly and ruthlessly. What surprised me most was how the lawyer had managed to manipulate both Harold's family and his business, making everyone believe that Harold's death was actually a stroke of luck for him. He knew the heir's fragility and the complicated relationships between them. He had infiltrated Harold's life deeply, exploiting his weaknesses and family disputes to build his own network of advantages. But how had he managed to maintain his influence undetected? How had he manipulated all the pieces without anyone realizing his true intentions? Now, with this new discovery, I knew the case was far from over. The lawyer wasn't just another supporting player in Harold's story, he was the puppet master, manipulating everyone involved to create a situation where he would emerge victorious. And while he remained silent, manipulating from behind the scenes, the family was so caught up in their own squabbles and despair that they never imagined he was behind it all. The truth was finally coming out, but with it came more questions than answers. How could I capture the real culprit when he was so skilled at hiding? I was closer to the truth than ever, but the discovery made me realize that the twist was just the beginning of an even deeper plot. As the truth began to emerge, it wasn't just the Williams family that was in the spotlight. Harold Williams's case quickly became a public spectacle, attracting the media and generating a wave of legal and social repercussions no one had anticipated. The discovery that the lawyer, seemingly a simple advisor, was behind all the manipulations not only shook the family but also shook the worlds of business and justice. The press, always ready to fuel a good scandal, quickly seized on the story, creating a storm of speculation and theories. The case was now in the headlines, and everyone wanted to know who would be held responsible for Harold's death. The fight for the inheritance was turning into a fight for reputation and control of public narratives. The media, as usual, loved a good villain, and the lawyer became the focus of all attention. Reports detailed his discreet rise within Harold's circle and his manipulation of events to his own advantage. But the real turning point came when investigations revealed that, in addition to everything he had done, the lawyer was involved in illicit financial schemes with outside companies, using Harold as a central figure to covertly move large sums of money. As if that weren't enough, a series of testimonies from other clients who had been harmed by him began to emerge, demonstrating his history of manipulation and fraud. It was as if finally the entire web of lies he had built was crumbling before his eyes. In the courtroom, the tension was palpable. The legal battle was no longer just about Harold's death, but about who would be held accountable for the legal manipulations that had led to the tragedy. The family was divided, with accusations flying back and forth, each member trying to defend their own failings. However, the lawyer had an ace up his sleeve. He knew how families can get lost in their own rivalries and that strong emotions can be the key to weakening a case. While everyone was focused on fighting each other, he played the game differently, trying to dodge the accusations and using his innocence as a shield. But the truth was that while the heirs were arguing over the inheritance and trying to shield themselves from accusations, attention was shifting away from Harold's death and toward the manipulations of power and control. The lawyer was becoming the new target, While the story of Harold's death, which had begun as a simple case of a poisoned inheritance, morphed into a spectacle of revenge, betrayal, and greed. What was on trial was no longer just the crime, but the idea of who truly controlled the public narrative and who would emerge victorious in the end. Meanwhile, journalists, always searching for the next big story, clung to the case tooth and nail, uncovering more secrets than ever before. The pressure mounted, and the legal repercussions only grew more intense as new elements emerged. Harold Williams's trial, which had appeared to be an internal dispute over assets, had now become a spectacle of unexpected proportions. The outcome of the Harold Williams case was undoubtedly one of the most bittersweet resolutions of my career. After months of investigations, manipulations, and revelations, the truth was finally exposed. The lawyer who had hidden in the shadows was brought to justice and eventually convicted of a series of crimes, including fraud, will manipulation, and conspiracy to murder Harold. But the real tragedy, in my view, was not the punishment of the guilty party, but the way everyone involved emerged from this process. The Williams family, in their fight for the inheritance, destroyed what remained of their ties. Reconciliation was no longer possible. Money, which had been the center of all disputes, became but a distant memory, while the emotional and psychological damage remained forever. Robert, the eldest son, was the most affected. In his desperate quest to obtain what he believed was his birthright, he lost everything, including the respect and trust of others. He not only lost his inheritance, but also the chance to rebuild relationships with other family members. His obsession with money and power blinded him to what truly mattered. Sarah, the rebellious daughter, was also left empty-handed, but her greatest loss was emotional. She had the chance to reconnect with her family and understand the mistakes of the past, but she chose to wallow deeper in the shadows of anger and resentment. Emily, Harold's wife, lived with the weight of guilt for her choices, knowing she had been part of such a sinister plot and that the consequences would be forever. But as the family fractured, there was another loss that could not be ignored: Harold's own memory. The legacy of a man who, before his death, believed he was leaving a prosperous future for his heirs was distorted into something much darker. What he believed to be his inheritance to the family turned into a cruel struggle, with everyone involved losing out in the process. What should have been an act of care, love, and legacy ended up being a tragedy in which no one emerged victorious. The moral of the story, as in so many cases, is that power, greed, and desperation can destroy everything valuable, leaving a trail of destruction that cannot be easily repaired. As an investigator, I learned a valuable lesson during this case. Sometimes the truth is harder to deal with than lies. Justice, even if served, cannot restore what was lost, nor heal the wounds caused. What seemed like a simple dispute over a man's inheritance turned out to be a bitter lesson in human nature, in how our flaws, our fears, and our deepest desires can shape the fate of everyone around us. And in the end, the true tragedy was not just Harold's death, but everything it unleashed, creating a path of irreparable destruction. Now that you've delved into this case full of twists and turns and mysteries with me, it's time to reflect. What would you do if you were in the shoes of one of Harold's heirs? The pressure for inheritance, the fight for recognition, and the desperate choices that force us to make decisions that could destroy not only our family, but also our own lives. It's easy to look at this case and think things couldn't happen to us, but could they? Are you making the right decisions in your own struggles, whether personal, professional, or even intimate? And more importantly, what will you do to ensure you're not being manipulated, or worse, manipulating others to achieve your own goals? If you learned something from this story, now is the time to take action. How can you apply this knowledge to your life, to improve your choices, protect your loved ones, and ensure that what you value isn't distorted by power struggles and control? If this video has made you reflect, now is your turn to decide what change will you make in your life. If you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe to the channel now. Turn on notifications to stay up to date with all upcoming videos, because this story is far from over. Don't put it off. Take the first step today.